took a while to confirm. So I'm grateful that you're able to make it. I'd like to thank Dr. Mercy Kwambe for joining us today. Dr. Kwambe is the co-director at STARE, Stand to End Rape, an organization Global Rights has had a long-standing relationship with, and of course that we're very proud of their work. And of course, my very own brother, and that's why I can introduce him last because it's my mother's last born, MSK Mohammed Sabu Kiena, who is the original Almajiri, who is doing phenomenal work with unaccompanied children, with Almajiri children, and providing access to education and social structure for them. Is doing phenomenal work. And why do we think that it's important for MSK to be here? Everybody else sounds like they're the normal people that you would have in the conversation talking about sexual and gender-based violence. But then the invisible people are the people most vulnerable to sexual and gender-based violence. And the work that Muhammad is doing is protecting them every day from the predators that live in our society. And today is going to tell us how we're failing them and how we can redeem ourselves as a community, as a country. And so I'd like to welcome everybody else. And I'm sorry I'm calling you everybody else. I'd like to name everyone attending today for joining us in this very important conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a critical conversation that we cannot avoid holding. Now, about 10 years ago, UNICEF, in collaboration with National Population Commission, had released figures on gender-based violence. And they told us that before 18, 1 in every 4 girls and 1 in every 10 boys will experience some form of sexual violence. That is before the threshold for violence went higher in Nigeria with the multifaceted violence that we have, whether it is terrorists or bandits, communities being attacked. That violence has become very commonplace in Nigeria. So has death. Death is so commonplace that we do not think about other forms of violence. As a matter of fact, at Global Rights, we record the number of deaths as an indicator to the temperature of a country when it comes to violence. But there are other things we need to measure. One of them is gender-based violence. The face of violence is a woman. That when women are more susceptible to violence, then the entire society is more susceptible to violence, or rather it's an indicator, it's an early warning that violence is increasing and it's rising. And it's not just girls, because sometimes we make sure that we create a structure that protects women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence, and then we leave out the boys on the basis of their gender. And it is increasing in our society that more and more boys and men, especially in our theaters of violence, are becoming victims of sexual and gender-based violence. I'm reminded of many years ago of a particular case, and I'll give you a case of how our system is failing our children, our women, and our men in the response they have to sexual and gender-based violence. Many years ago in Ibadan, I got a call from Ibadan about a girl who was being sexually molested by her father. It is no longer news. It's in the news every day. But back then, just about 10 years ago, it was news. It was heartbreaking news. And the question was what to do. So we decided, let's get this matter reported to the police and let's get the state to provide security for her, a shelter, help her get back to school, and everything that she needs. So the case was reported to the police and also to the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Oyo State. The father was arrested. His family, of course, raised a lot of dust. Her mother was late, and his family raised a lot of dust, and her mother's family did not step to the plate at that point in time. And then I turned around and 2 weeks later, the girl had run away. And I said, why would she run away? Where did she run away from? And it turned out that between the police and the Ministry of Women's Affairs, they had put the girl in a juvenile home. She committed no crime. Rather, she was the victim of a crime, but she ended up in a juvenile home where, of course, she was maltreated. And of course, that her father's family were also threatening her. Like you, I know many women who are being in abusive relationships, but do not leave. And people keep saying, why can't she leave? And she says, because of the children. Not so much that she thinks that the children deserve a monstrous father, but where does she go with 4 children without a job that can sustain them to provide shelter for them, with the threat that he or his family will attack her again? Where does she go? Abuja, for example, has 2 shelters that cannot cater to the myriads of women who are victims of domestic violence. And a lot of times that when we go to the police station, what you hear is go and settle with him. You two, don't be rude to your husband, as though he was an owner. We are losing too many people to sexual and gender-based violence because our institutions are working in silos. They're not working together even when they mean well. The police is not working with women's affairs, with social, with the Office of Social Security are not working together in any form whatsoever. Schools are not working to also report incidents of what they know to be sexual and gender-based violence. Our hospitals are not integrated into the systems. And when they are, as in the case of Lagos, resources are very limited. Lagos remains a stellar example of how you can make inter and intra-agency protocols around sexual and gender-based violence. And in 2017, Global Rights Ad, together with several partners, including Mrs. Palm, who is on the call today, developed a sexual and gender inter and intra-agency protocol for sexual and gender-based violence response. Needless to say, our government has failed to implement this. Today's conversation is not just to have a conversation, but also to ensure that we make room for solutions to these problems, that we make recommendations, workable recommendations that can be implemented both by civil society, by government, and by communities. So again, I welcome you and hope that we have an enriching conversation, which does not end with just being a conversation, but is the beginning of better response to sexual and gender-based violence. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ma, for that brilliant and wonderful opening. I think that just, sets the tone for the conversation today. And so Miss Abby introduced everyone, but I did not introduce her, and when she spoke about the work that many other people, that the panelists in this conversation have done, it's important to also highlight her work as the Executive Director of Global Rights, not only in that capacity, but also outside that capacity, which she has consistently, advocated for the policy visibility of women and worked hard to prevent and address violence against them. So which also brings me to some of the work that we have done here at Global Rights. Part of what she talked about with regards to the gaps in responding to survivors of gender-based violence reminded me of a case that we were actually handling about a month ago in Kano State, where we also had someone who was a victim of sexual violence, and she was a young girl who was sexually violated by a much older man. Now, of course, the man was arrested by the police and all of that was going on, the legal proceedings were taking place, but there wasn't really anything in place to ensure the survivor's well-being. So she was still stuck in that cycle of victimhood, in that she couldn't fully transition into a survivor because she was dealing with a lot of mental and emotional trauma that was just left unaddressed. So a lot of times we see this happen where in the pursuit of justice, we end up neglecting the actual needs and the well-being of the victim. And because of that, we don't see they are not able to come out, on the other side and transition into survivors. And those are the things that sort of breed that suppressed trauma that's left unresolved are things that can then be catalysts for any kind of retaliation, conflict, or violence in the future. I always say that gender-based violence is not just a consequence of conflict, it's also a cause. So, which brings me to the first point of our conversation. I know that Ms. Abby has done a great job, just sort of identifying what the general gaps in the system look like today. But more specifically, I would like for us to shed more light, especially since we have people here on this call who can actually learn from this. I would like for us to talk more on the gaps that currently exist within the Nigerian system, specifically identifying them and identifying the effect of these gaps on the lives of survivors and victims of gender-based violence. So, Dr. Mercy, if you can hear me, I think that's something I'd like for you to respond to. Basically, in the work that you have done, in Stand to End Rape, I'm sure you would have seen a lot of this manifest in the course of your work. What are some of the gaps you think exist currently in the Nigerian context? And what is the effect of these gaps in the lives of victims of gender-based violence in Nigeria?
All right, thank you so much, Noya. I just want to check that I can be heard. I would like you to permit me to turn off my video. I'm having network issues, but thank you for the question. I would like to do a brief introduction because I can see that Mohammed is on the call, and I used to know Mohammed a long time ago. And we've done some work together previously. That's personally before I fully assumed my role at STAIR a couple of months ago. One of the things that has pushed me into this work is also my interest in children. I did write my PhD thesis on sexual violence against children in Nigeria and looking at it from the law enforcement angle. You ask what are the gaps, and in my head, I'm just trying to see how I can tell you all the gaps within a very short period of time because the gaps are enormous. Same way Nigeria suffers from porous borders is the same way we suffer from porous laws as well. Currently, as we see it, we have so many laws that actually protect the rights of survivors in Nigeria. But you see, in every country, right, or in every administration or in every government, there needs to be coordination and there needs to be accountability across every arm of government. So when you have these laws, but these laws are not properly implemented or effected, then there's a problem. And that would mean that it will also affect the judicial processes as well. So I remember you cited a case recently, and I also want to cite a case of a survivor that I know that STAIR helped like 10 years ago, who only got justice this year. And it depends on what your definition of justice is. Is justice saying that the case is closed, or is justice actually saying that the survivor gets, what was due? And in this case, we classified justice as just getting the case closed and making sure that the perpetrator was being apprehended, and the survivor at this point had even moved out of the country. So this was done in absentia of the survivor. I would say that one of the gaps that we see again is coordinated efforts. If we leave the state agents, even amongst the NGO CSO space, there is a lot of uncoordinated efforts. And again, it's a reflection of our government, because again, CSOs and NGOs don't have the ability to arrest any perpetrator. That means that whatever we do, we constantly have to work with law enforcement. You also know that, in Nigeria, there are some particular institutions that are regarded to have credibility. So when a survivor comes to us, we have to refer them to those institutions. We have to refer them to SAC centers. Sometimes SAC centers don't have the required resources to treat these cases. Then we have to outsource these cases as well. So you find the uncoordinated efforts. You also find that one of the things that bridges, that also causes a gap in responses is the fact that most CSOs and NGOs are donor funded. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by donor funded is that they rely on external resources to be able to meet the needs of survivors. However, once that money finishes and there is no future donor, then that becomes a problem. I know this about St. Andre before I joined, that at some particular point, I think this was just immediately after the pandemic, there was a gap where we couldn't function effectively for survivors. So most of the services that we could give were services that we could give pro bono. For instance, we could give legal advice, we could give mental health support systems, and then we could also encourage our survivors to make an official police report. However, every other support that they needed, like for instance, in cases where a survivor needs like a safe space, we couldn't provide that because we did not have the funding to do so. So these are some of the gaps that just come to the top of my head. And another gap I would like to also mention, because this was also cited in the concept note, is the gap of data. Most of the data we have are not aggregated. Most of the data we have is basically from the control room of the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs. And that data is only on reported cases. But recently, I attended a seminar that was organized by the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs in tandem with the UNFPA. And at that meeting, it was discovered that even that data that is being presented is what was given to the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs. There were still gaps within the gender desk in Nigeria, having to report official cases that have actually been reported at the state and local government levels. So these are some of the gaps that come to the top of my head. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mercy. So there's a lot to unpack here, and you have mentioned the porous legal system and framework in Nigeria. You talked about the lack of coordination, at the state level and among CSOs and NGOs alike. You talked about funding and you talked about data. I think this just would inform my next question, especially when you talked about, the legal framework and the legal systems. So I think I'll direct this question to Barrister Deji, if you can hear me. This is something that's very critical, because recently, I'm sure we're all familiar with the case of Dr. Olaleye, and we saw that he was someone who was sentenced to life imprisonment for the rape of his wife's niece, and then all of a sudden, on appeal, the case, he was discharged and acquitted, and then we started hearing, oh, there was nobody to witness the actual age of the child to establish that she was a minor, and this is somebody who has an established case of repeated abuse consistently on this girl, but then it's showing, we see somebody getting discharged and acquitted on what you would call a technicality or some procedural issue rather than actual evidence of a crime. So I think that would inform my next question to Barrister Deji, if you can just shed more light a little on what these gaps are exactly within the legal system in Nigeria, and how these gaps can be effectively addressed. Mr. Deji, can you hear me?
I'm so sorry, Noya. I could hear you, and then just 10 seconds into your question, I stopped hearing you. So please, I would not mind if you would repeat the question, please.
Okay.
And sorry, please, may I just seek permission to put off my video to save bandwidth, because I think the network here is really poor.
Okay, that's fine. Is it better now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I think my network is also not very strong. Okay, so I was speaking on the legal gaps, the gaps within the legal system we have in Nigeria, and I cited the case of Dr. Olaleye, who was recently discharged and acquitted because at the appellate court, it was stated that the court of first instance failed to properly establish the age of the survivor. So it was said that the girl could not be ascertained a minor because there were no witnesses there to actually confirm her age. And this is somebody who was proved to have raped his wife's niece multiple times. And on that count alone of the issue of his confession being signed under duress, in quotes, and the victim's age being in contention, he was acquitted. So I just wanted to touch more on the current legal gaps we have within the system in Nigeria, specifically, and how those gaps can be addressed, as your own experience as a lawyer and as a human rights lawyer. What are some of the gaps that you have identified within the legal framework in addressing issues of gender-based violence and violence against vulnerable people generally in Nigeria?
All right. Thank you so much for having me again. Um, yes, there are certainly gaps within the legal framework for the protection of persons from gender-based violence within our legal system. And of course, the case of Dr. Lale, and there are so many cases. But what I think is sometimes what a lot of us get to miss, and I say a lot of us, including lawyers, is that we get to think that the problem is with the letters of the law. But that's not where the problem is most of the time. You will find that it is the manifestation of the spirit of the law that is problematic. And so if we want to really address the issue, then we must look at every participant within the justice system, from the first responders up until, the final stage, that is, if a matter proceeds to litigation, to court, the judicial side of it. And you will find that what we need to do really most of the time is perhaps more and more training. Yeah, I know that quite a lot of organizations are doing a lot in terms of training, but there is still quite a lot that needs to be done. So, for instance, now as a lawyer, and I'm speaking based on experience, a lot of times when cases like this come up, we just tend to jump into a frenzy and gather our law books. Oh yeah, VAP Act, and it's there, and then we proceed to court without taking our time to actually plan. And cases need to be planned. Cases need to be planned because sometimes if you do not plan, you meet a brick wall later in future that you could have actually taken care of from the very beginning. So sometimes some of these issues, it is important that lawyers that work in these areas are properly trained and they retrained too from time to time. And moving from that, even talking about, for instance, the first responders. I've talked about first responders. Let me give you a story of something that happened last week that gave me serious fright. We got a complaint in our office from a woman. We got that complaint about 3 weeks ago from a woman who is and was being abused by her husband. And he had threatened, in fact, he had given her a date, I think 15th of December, when he would send her packing and take the children away from her. And what we did was we filed a complaint at NAPTIP. NAPTIP subsequently, after taking her statements and all of that, invited the husband over the phone. The husband refused to come. In fact, he threatened the officer who reached out to him. He warned him never to call him again. Now, to my surprise and chagrin too, this officer advised this woman to go home and that they would come to the house, a few days after them, to arrest the husband. And in my head, I could not understand why. You have reached out to the husband. The man now knows that she has filed a formal complaint before you. This is a woman that, even without a complaint, was being abused. Quite naturally, you are just basically sending that woman to her death. So I think some of these things, it's important that we train those who are the actors beyond just there's need for us to put empathy in the work that we do, and that has to include every actor along the line. Let me also give you another example of an experience I had a few years ago at the Court of Appeal. It was a matter that emanated from Niger State. It was a case of rape of a minor, not just a minor who had diminished mental capacity. And we didn't handle the matter at the trial, but it was apparent to me the moment the Niger State government handed over the file to us and we studied it, I could see that the judge, who apparently was very, very, very clearly unhappy about what had happened, allowed her emotions to play into the case. And where she could have done certain things that could have saved the day, she failed to do them. And at the end of the day, we took the matter on appeal, but the conviction that was secured, the conviction by that judge at the trial stage was upturned on appeal. All that the judge needed to do to save the day was, while yes, there is nothing in the law that says the evidence of a minor is not adequate to support a conviction, but the judge is required to warn him or herself that there is a risk in doing so, but that they have considered the risk, that they are satisfied even at that stage with the testimony of the minor. All she needed to do was to insert a paragraph in her judgment with this clause, and that would have saved the day, but she failed to do so. And I believe it was because she allowed her emotions to get the best of her. So the truth of the matter is that the gaps that we face, the real gaps in within the legal framework is with the implementation. It is with the manner with which we give life to those provisions of the law. But by and large, if you ask me, our local legislations, our international obligations as encapsulated in the international legal instruments that Nigeria has signed onto, they provide reasonably adequate protection for persons who may be suffering from gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence.
Thank you very much, sir. So basically, what from your perspective, it is less of a legal issue and more of an interpretation issue. And you recommend capacity building for, lawyers and first responders and the entire system, such that what is contained in the law is translated as so, and people do not let their own human elements play in, and people fully understand what the law intends, and that intention is what is met. So thank you very much, sir, for that. Okay, so we have in all of this, we have sort of identified the general problem of lack of coordination, and even at the legal level, where we see that a lot of lawyers are undertrained, and it still comes down to a coordination problem and coordination challenge, in that people within the system don't seem to fully understand their role within that system and how to adequately execute that role. So, which brings me to Ms. Grace. Let's talk about the work you do with the Human Rights Commission as the Director of the Women and Gender Department. What role do you think the Human Rights Commission can play in building better collaboration with the government, in bridging these gaps that we have talked about today?
Oh, okay, thank you so much for having me. At the National Human Rights Commission, especially my department, as you know, the National Human Rights Commission is the body that has been statutorily given the mandate to promote, to protect, and to enforce human rights in Nigeria. So my department particularly deals with issues of human rights violation against women and children. And over the years, we have worked closely with other government agencies. We have worked with NGOs, and we have worked with FIDA. We have worked with other bodies, and organizations that work in this area. But the gap I have noticed is that, most of these organizations, everybody wants to take credit for doing the work. A reported case comes to you. Some victims, report cases of violation against them. And obviously, these things are the issues of violations against women, gender-based violence is multifaceted, it has different angles to it. And no one organization can handle it. There's no one stop shop, for handling issues of GBV. But sometimes people want to bite more than they can eat and just take it upon themselves and think from the beginning to the end, you can handle it by yourself. But I beg to say that, it's almost impossible, even in situations where Abby had mentioned earlier, when we have the SAC in Lagos, for example, where they refer to it as a one-stop, shop for for GBV, handling of GBV issues. I mean, they still need other supporting bodies, you know, so you can't handle it alone. In my work, I have noticed that sometimes, because the Human Rights Commission, we do not appear in court on behalf of our complainants. So what we do is, when an issue comes to us, especially when it has to do with a criminal issue, you know, GBV criminal issues like rape, we receive it and then report it to the police station. We'll go with the survivor to the police station and make sure we report it, and then follow up to ensure that, you know, justice is done at the end of the day, because the police are the ones that prosecute, you know, or the Ministry of Justice. We now also have NAPTIP that is doing it. So we partner with this, we partner with NAPTIP for prosecution. We partner with the police for prosecution. We partner with the Ministry of Justice, you know, for prosecution. But, you know, sometimes when it's just an issue of, you know, a husband abandoning his family, not, you know, living up to his expectations as the breadwinner of the family, because we have a lot of that coming to our office. You know, we call it maybe a wife and child abandonment, you know. And but when such comes, we usually will like invite the man and get to know why this is happening. We work it around it, we mediate around it, and ensure that, you know, the parties understand each other, they understand their roles in the family, and the woman and the couple can support each other, you know, so that they will ensure that their children, you know, and don't become victims of abandonment, and at the end of the day, sometimes become victims of violence. So my advice is that all of us, you know, players in this field, we must work together. If you come to a point when you're handling a matter or you're handling a complaint, you come to a point where you need another partner. You know you can't go further. I mean, you can refer it. So we should have like a clear referral pathway, like Abby mentioned earlier. We tried to do something like that, but if you don't have the buying of the government, it is very difficult to push that, to push it through. So I'll still go back to it. Let's have clear referral pathways where, you know, one organization does one part, another one does one part, rather than, you know, what we're doing now, working in silos, trying to get credits for complaints, and at the end of the day, it's the complainant that suffers, it's the victim or the survivor that suffers at the end of the day. Because if you're not able to do it, some people, you know, just halfway, they leave, the complaint is frustrated, the complaint is, you know, at that point, nobody is taking it, you're not able to complete it. And, you know, like the victim suffers at the end of the day. So for me, it's not about who handles the issue at the end of the day, but it's about the victim or the survivor getting justice. That's what we're all about. That's why we call ourselves human rights defenders, human rights activists. Is that at the end of the day, we're able to give the service, you know, to the victims or the survivors, the service they need, the justice they need, not about taking credit to myself, to you or to your organization. So I think we should try and go back to that, try as much as possible to ensure that we have a clear referral pathways. This one person takes a part and another one, you know, takes the other part, because we can't all do it alone. So that's my take.
Thank you very much, Ma. So that's a very robust response, and there's so much to learn from that. You're speaking about collaboration. You're speaking about a response pathway wherein every actor is involved and knows what their responsibilities are within that matrix to ensure that response is survivor-centered and survivor-focused. And as somebody who has done a lot of work in this field, in this area, for global rights, we have done, work with women and vulnerable groups as well. And I'm sure Ms. Abby can speak a lot about some of the informal justice systems that we have seen play out in some of the work that we have done, both at the community level and in other capacities as well. I would like to hear from her if she can hear me on if there are any opportunities for collaboration or integration of this informal justice system into formal response frameworks. And I know that these informal systems do present their own challenges, but I remember listening to a conversation such as this where it was mentioned that although they have their challenges, they
Hi, Noya, are you still there? It seems we may have lost Noya.
I'm so sorry. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. You
The
were
internet
talking
just
about
went off.
challenges. I wasn't sure if you were even directing the question to me. So
So I was talking about the challenges in some of the informal systems we have observed in the course of the work that we have done here at Global Rights and the work that you have done in your own capacity. Some of the informal response systems we have seen, what the challenges are, and if there are opportunities for integration into broader formal response frameworks in Nigeria.
okay, so I'm just going to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Emeka Ononomadu on the call today. It's so good to have you, sir. Welcome. The challenges with the informal system. First of all, let me start with the challenges with the formal system. That if the formal system was effective and was working, then we wouldn't have as much problem with the informal system. It's also about the way in which we framed sexual and gender-based violence in Nigeria. We have failed to treat it as it is, a crime. That violence against another person is a crime. And even more so when that violence is against a vulnerable person. So first of all, that the framing isn't there as a society. And so the responses are not responses to crime. They seem to be responses to misdemeanor, to morality, that we deal with these issues from a morality perspective and from a misdemeanor perspective. And so we allow impunity to continue to thrive. So from the formal sector, for example, the courts, the police, the way in which ministries, for example, Ministry of Women's Affairs, handle this issue, the way in which we think about the issue impacts the way in which we respond to the issue, so that we are mediating between a case of a father that raped his child and the mother of the child. Why? And that when that is done in the formal sector, that by the time we get into the informal setting, we do not expect any better. We don't expect, for example, that the community head to whom a case of sexual violence or domestic violence is reported will take the time to ensure that the perpetrator is handed over to the police. That when they're handed over to the police thinks that their job is to mediate, even when they have a gender desk, or to ask questions like, what were you wearing? So if police is asking, what were you wearing? How much more in the informal sector, those type of questions will be asked as well. When there also no structure that are victim-centered, then the responses will not be victim-centered. As you rightly noted earlier, Noya, that a lot of the responses don't even think about the victim, how to protect the victim. And exactly just as Mrs. Palmer said, we're not really just working to protect the victim and ensure that the victim is resilient and is able to get across this. Ms. Ajare spoke about how we tend to also push the victim back to the perpetrator in the formal sector. How much more than in the informal sector? And I think that when we say the informal sector, and let me be very clear about the informal settings that I'm talking about. I'm talking about, like community aids, the associations, families, neighborhood groups, vigilantes, and the way in which they respond to gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence, is still grossly inadequate because the formal response agencies themselves haven't quite gotten a grip on how we should frame these issues. So there's a lot of problems. Which shelters do we have informally to place victims? What channels do we also have to ensure that when matters are reported to the police, they immediately go to court? Sorry, this is not about sexual or gender-based violence, but I'd like us to visit how quick the police were to carry, what's his name? And now when I need to remember, maybe because it's not part of this conversation, I really, this man that was taken to Ekiti.
Okay.
Farotimi.
Thank
Daily
you.
Farotimi.
Farotimi. That the way in which the speed and the brutality with which the police took someone that was accused of libel or defamation and was so brutally treated and carried away is not the same attitude I see when it is a perpetrator of sexual or gender-based violence. It's not also the same speed at which the court is sitting, at which the court is sentencing, at which evidence is being collected that we see. And so it is a pitch against the invisible, and that invisible people are lost in all of this, especially in informal settings. And maybe if you help us understand also better, Noya, what exactly you also wanted for us to talk about in informal settings.
Okay, I think you have already pretty much established it. We're talking about, community and traditional rulers and how they tend to resolve their own way, very put that in quotes, of resolving certain disputes. We have seen that in the course of our work, how sometimes they say, oh, this can be settled this way, this can be settled that way.
Yes.
Than use the regular formal system. Why don't we? This is the system that we practice. This is what we do. This is how we go about it. So I think, like you have rightly mentioned, some of the challenges that are bound with that, there is hardly ever any justice served to the perpetrator. And at the end of the day, there isn't really any survival centeredness in that response, in that the victim or survivor still has to deal with the trauma and the psychological and emotional effects, like you have rightly said. But it's something that has become, would I say, a roadblock now, because of the work that we have done, especially when you're dealing with it at the grassroots and the community level, because they are accustomed to handling things their own way, in quotes. So when you start to introduce the formal systems, it's foreign to them, and sometimes they're met with a lot of resistance. So I think that's just, but thank you very much, Ma, for that. I think we would segue to, we've talked a lot about women and other vulnerable groups, but Mr. Mohammed is here and he can shed more light on children. Now, a lot of times in these conversations, there isn't a lot of focus on children as part of, when we speak about violence against vulnerable people, we tend not to remember children, and we tend not to remember children, especially those in northern Nigeria, some of whom might have been affected by conflict in one way or the other. So he has done extensive work, advocating for the rights of these children, and maybe he can shed more light on how those children are affected, especially those affected by GBV, those vulnerable children, and the unique challenges that they face, that particular demographic, the unique challenges they face in accessing support.
Thank you so much, Noya. Good afternoon, everyone. And it's good to see everybody's face. Grace, Miss Abby, thank you so much. And I would like to start by at least commenting on two previous discussion points. And I feel it's something that is important and needs to continue to be reinforced, in conversation like this and elsewhere. One is the one raised by, I think, Grace Pam, where she talks about how organizations like to take credit for the work they started, and then in the process, the survivor, the victim get lost in the whole thing. So I think this point is very, very important for organizations to take note, and for us working in these sectors to know that this isn't a competition, and the work we do is for the victims and not about us and all of that. And so it's very, very important that we ensure that our actions and response are indeed coherent with the interests of the people we are working with. And when we continue to prioritize our own success or our own taking credit for what we do, and at the end of the day, those who are fighting for get missed out of it, is something that we as NGOs and organizations working around this place should be very, very worried about. So I thank you so much, Ms. Grace, for raising that. I think is very important. The other point I wanted to also highlight or talk about was the lack of coherence, between the interventions that people do and that of the victims. You start the case, and then you kind of stop it halfway, leaving the victim, almost lost in the whole thing. I think we must be able to start a case and finish it all through. That includes not just winning the case in court, but also ensuring the survivor or the victims' reintegration and support within the community they live. So I think these points are very important to continue to be highlighted. So talking about vulnerable communities like children, especially, of course, the Almajiri children, and maybe those in IDP centers, and especially those in rural communities. Most of the conversation we usually have and the reports that we say, or the cases that were highlighted over and over, are mostly in city center, urban. I can bet that mostly. I think need for us organizations working around space to devise ways of spotlighting this GBV issue in rural community, ensuring that teams in rural communities get spotlighted, and we ensure that they get justice for any violation that they may have encountered. And something that the decade-long negligence of rural community is, the root cause of the whole thing. There are many communities, not just in northern Nigeria, but across the south as well. Complete lack of governance in those communities. And so when you talk about the informal system and either the gap or their failure to respond to GBV cases in communities, it has to do with the fact that there is complete absence of governance in those communities. And so if the goal and the priority of such communities is to maintain the moral, consciousness, or the unity of their communities, maybe because of religious consideration, there's no way you will ensure justice for such victims if there is zero absence of governance in such community. And in the Almajiri situation, there's a particular case that an Almajiri child was sexually violated by somebody in the street. He has repeatedly been sexually abused by somebody in the street, in Bauchi State, actually. We pursued the case. We reported the issue, and up to the point that I think the person was taken to court for the first instance. But there was, indeed pressure from the community that forced us to let the case died down, and the boy was just sent back to the community without any treatment, unfortunately, and the perpetrator, was not held accountable. You know. So vulnerable children, vulnerable population like children in the situation like the Almajiri, and those invisible in the rural community face significant challenge, especially lack of access, because they don't even know that they are either violated or they need to report the situation. So a lot of them are innocent. They are also ignorant about their situation. And part of what we organization are also initiating now to do is raising more children and community rights advocates, and who will be championing awareness issues like this, around children, just subtly informing them about their rights and some of these issues, so that that would be the best way of ensuring some level of for them. Then getting from about issues like this. Then, of course, those who are training, when they notice it, we can be able to really pursue it at that level. But essentially, what I want to mention about the challenges of communities and children in the the South community face is that lack of access and lack of awareness on their own part, and of course the absence of governance structures, mechanism within the community where like these affected rural vulnerable communities can be addressed or can be. So let's look at the root causes of some of these issues, and those that really continue to undermine access to justice and accountability around those vulnerable children. The vulnerable community like the Almajiri and those will continue to face these big cases and any form of accountability. Thank you, Noya.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, my camera is off because my network is not very strong here. But thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed. So you talked about access, talked about awareness, and you talked about the lack of governance structures within those systems, and how because of that they consistently continue to be violated and re-victimized. Which brings me to my next question, and I would like for Dr. Mercy and Ms. Abby to respond to this one. But I'll start with Dr. Mercy. Because you have done lots of programming, tailored and geared towards responding to survivors and victims of gender-based violence, how do you think can be included in designing response frameworks without feeling exploited or re-traumatized?
Sorry, no, I didn't catch that. How do I think what?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you better now.
Okay, yeah. So I was speaking about how Mohammed talked about the lack of awareness and access and governance structures. And one thing we have seen, even with programming for us as NGOs, is that you can see the obvious gaps. So even the gaps that exist within the system, you talked about the gaps within the NGO and CSO framework. What we have seen, though, is that sometimes in the implementation process, you can see that there wasn't a lot of involvement of actual victims in designing the entire, program or initiative. So what do you think are the best practices for involving these people, integrating them into the system where they have a say in such response frameworks without them feeling exploited or re-traumatized, because it's a very thin line and that sometimes it's difficult to walk.
Okay, so if I hear you right, you're asking how can we include victims to foster a survivor-based response system, yeah?
Okay.
Sorry, the network is going. I don't know if it's my network. Okay, so basically, I Thank you, Mrs. Palm, for actually pointing out that gap that exists with, organizations trying to prioritizing who takes credit, right, for a case rather than being survivor-centered. This is a major problem in this space that needs to actually be talked about. Before transitioning into the CSO NGO space, one of my concerns was basically just looking at it from the sidelines and seeing how on different social medias you see there were cases that went very viral, and you can see organizations trying to take credit for this. And again, like I stated earlier, you find that this is also a reflection of the Nigerian system as a whole, because even at the Nigerian system, you have a lot of interagency rivalry, right, that goes on. And this is what you also see in other spaces as well. So in order for us to be able to include survivors' perspective into responding to sexual and gender-based violence, the first and key thing for every stakeholder is to adopt a survivor-centered approach, right? It's not about, and that's why I really appreciate what Mrs. Pam said earlier, where if you do not have the capacity, look for a sister organization that has the capacity to respond to cases. There are times where at Stanton Hendrick, we've had no, maybe we have no lawyer, and obviously as non-trade lawyers, we'll have to outsource that response to an organization that has that system. So adopting a survivor-based or a survivor-centered approach would also respect the survivor as an agency. It would create empathy and respect. It would also mean that you need to have educated people. And when I say educated people, I mean specialized people who have been trained, right, to deal with survivors. There's a lot of trauma response that has to go into every response that is given. And one of the common things that I see happening in this space is where, sometimes survivors are kind of cajoled into taking certain steps that they might not be prepared for. So there was a case that I read about involving a different organization where this particular lady was talking about how she wasn't ready for a legal case. She wasn't ready to stand in front of a court because she was still dealing with a lot of trauma. And again, she was still mandated because there was no safe space to keep her. So because of that, she had to still stay with her abuser, which overcomplicated things, because staying with her abuser meant that she could not heal from the trauma that she was already experiencing. Staying with the abuser meant that she was also afraid for her life, hence why she did not want to, go forward with making a police case and taking it legal. But because, she was put in front of that system without necessarily having the support that she needed, that overcomplicated things for her, that she had to go into hiding for several months, right? Another step that has to be taken, which is very crucial, is that engaging survivors as stakeholders as well. It is important to also listen to survivors, because the experiences of survivors of SGBV is not the same, right? You have contextual things to take into consideration. The context might be different, society might be different. I heard my colleagues talk about, alternative measures being taken in communities. One of the states that we've worked in enormously is Kwara State, and even in educating local communities on how to deal with SGBV, you have cases where traditional rulers come out and say, oh, in our community we only do this via ADR, so we're not willing to go to court. This is how we've always done this over time. And that is why it becomes essential to engage survivors as stakeholders, especially when it comes to the formation of laws and in response systems as well. Survivors will also give you a key perspective that you might not be able to get from other members of society. Being survivors of this particular kind of crime would inform you on how to best approach a survivor. Then we also have to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. And I say this especially when it comes to sexual violence against children. Yes, we have the national legislation that says that you cannot, disclose the face or the name of a minor. But at different times, because these are crimes that happen in communities, victims and survivors are often known by community members. And because of that, there's the stigmatization that comes with SGBV. So if we are to adopt a system that is survivor-centric, that seeks to help the survivor first, before any other nitty-gritty that comes with the whole process, we need to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. The survivor has to be protected at all costs. And this will mean that we have gotten to the point where I don't think we need to beat around the bush to say that SGBV is an epidemic situation. And during the pandemic, which we saw the rate of SGBV skyrocket because many people were forced to stay in an enclosed space with their abusers, the Nigerian Governors Forum had to declare a state of emergency on SGBV, and that's how bad it has gotten. And one would think that at this point, the government will carve out specialized funding for not just legal aid, but also for the protection of survivors. That's also very keen. Then we also have to think about capacity building. Again, on this call, Ms. Abby did talk about how most of the survivors are reliant on their abusers. But that's where capacity building comes in, because again, you have to economically empower survivors of SGBV to be able to live outside the confines of their abusers. You also have to adapt to cultural context. And I think when the ED of Sterling Law Center was speaking, when Deji was speaking, that was something I picked, right? That there is a lot of ill planning when it goes into even the legal process. So the problem is not that we don't have the laws, right? The problem is, how are these laws, carried out? How are they represented? And in trying to, adapt a cultural context, this is something that is very evident in the Nigerian legal system. Cultural content. I remember that on this call too, Ms. Abby pointed out of how what's his name again? You see, I've forgotten the name, just as somebody mentioned it. But the Farotimi, right? And how quickly he was picked up. If we adopt this same processes when it comes to SGBV, if we adopt these same methods, you will find that, impunity is one of the reasons why this crime keeps on happening over and over again. But if we're able to respond as fast as we respond to other things, then you'll find that, again, the crime is probably there's obviously going to be a decline, right, in how this crime is being committed. The last thing I would like to say is that when it comes to, infusing a survivor-centered response to SGBV, we need to be able to validate feedback, right? And take feedback from survivors. Why I say this is because up till date, we still struggle with the response systems. Again, no organization can work without peculiar law enforcement agencies. Somebody mentioned NAPTIP on this call. Somebody mentioned the Nigerian Police Force on this call. NSCDC too has a gender desk as well. And we as CSOs and NGOs cannot function without working with these organizations. But sometimes when we get there and they've called us and we tell the survivor, oh, meet us at the police station. Before we get there, sometimes the survivor is behind bars. Sometimes the survivor is telling us that they've asked them, why. I know there was even a particular case where the girl was like one police officer, because she lives in the same environment as a police officer. He said, I know you're always outside in the night. So how can you come and say you were raped? Why are you always outside in the night? And all these things do not connote how we should respond to sensitive crimes. I always try to tell people that maybe it's the nature of the crime that makes us not believe that sexual violence is actually a crime against humanity and the state. Maybe if we think about it like robbery, because if somebody comes to you by 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. to say that my car was robbed, I doubt that your first question to them will be, why were you driving your car? Why were you sitting in the car? Or why were you outside at that particular time? You will show sympathy for that person. So these are some of the ways that I think that we can, adopt some survivor-centric responses to SGBV in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mercy. Thank you so much. Ms. Abby, is there any other perspective you'd like to bring to that?
Well, I think that you said it perfectly. Dr. Mercy said it perfectly, but if I would ask us to remember anything, and ask us to do anything, is that first of all, that we need a government that respects all citizens and manifestly does so, not just when they become victims of crime, at which point it won't work at all. There's very little respect in society for citizens, all citizens, whether, except of course, if you're rich and you've got political clout, then you might get some respect. But more often than not, there's absolutely no respect for citizens. So before people become victims, we must also begin to show them respect. We must culturalize our response institutions, the police, the civil service, and the courts, to show respect to all citizens. That way, as citizens, we also begin, because monkey see, monkey do, we also begin to learn to show respect to one another. The second point I'll make is, how do you make this more survivor-centered? You ask survivors what they want. That we need to talk more. And I wish that on this call, we had someone who was a survivor of sexual and gender-based violence who would like to talk about their experience. Join us on the panel and do so. Tell us what would have mattered to them at that material point in time. To have conversations with people who have been through the system, to ask them, how did you wish the system better served you? I think would be a way to go. And that when you have committees like, response agencies, SACs, like they do in Lagos, like we do in Abuja and a few other states, and a special shout out to British Council for the amazing work they've done in installing SACs all over our country, and which is a slap in our face, because if as Nigerians we do not fund SACs and we say that these citizens are important to us, then we lie. That to also ensure that each SAC has as former victims, as survivors on their advisory councils who can tell them what is important to survivors, and not just one type of survivor, because we also like this framing of a single story of different types of survivors, survivors who are male, survivors who are female, survivors who are children, survivors who are unemployed adults, survivors in different framings who can advise on what a survivor would need, would be very, very critical. Again, like I say, if you really truly want to say you're doing something for someone, ask them what they want to be done for them is critical. Changing, therefore, the golden rule from do to others what you wish will be done unto you to do for others what they need to be done for them, according to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's a powerful line, Ms. Abby. Okay, so for Barrister Deji, I would like to hear from your perspective with regards to law enforcement. What would you say are some of the best practices that maybe can be institutionalized within the system to ensure that survivors are not re-traumatized, especially during their interactions with law enforcement?
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you again, Noya. I had said earlier that it appears like what we just need to do is to keep expanding, increasing the knowledge of those actors within the stream of that justice system. And of course, that includes law enforcement. There is need for more training. There is need for capacity building. There is need to also monitor. I think sometimes it looks like CSOs drop the ball when they train law enforcement agents. We don't put in place proper monitoring mechanisms to actually see how they utilize the knowledge that they have acquired from some of the training. So maybe we just need to do more of that, because really, at the end of the day, I think if people are knowledgeable and they understand the impact and implications of the work that they do on the victims of GBV, they would actually do their work differently. That's my thought. And perhaps I should also add, as they say, to a carpenter, everything looks like nail and hammer. As a lawyer, for me, I also just want to emphasize the role of two things: the role of strategic litigation and public interest litigation in developing the jurisprudence around GBV. Now, again, one thing you understand, like I had said earlier, is that we have provisions, a lot of provisions, and a lot of them have been untested within our law books that can afford some reasonable level of protection and maybe support for victims. If we do not test them, if we do not take steps to, get the courts to, make pronouncements on them, those things will continue to remain dormant in the books. And so, for me, I think, well, while of course there has been quite a lot of talk about collaboration, about uh, you know, working. I mean, all actors within the system working together and internalizing some of these. But I think what on our part we need to start doing is this: identify uh, strategic cases that can help in developing the jurisprudence and then testing the law. I I am happy to actually hear that quite a lot of organizations anyway are taking up a lot of cases too under the VAP Act and the Child Rights Act, but there's still quite a lot that needs to be done. Yeah, the legal framework is robust, trust me, and its enforcement is where the problem is. Strategic litigation can compel government agencies to fulfill their obligations under these legal provisions. And they can also push government and government agencies to ensure that survivors receive adequate protection and that perpetrators are held accountable. Whenever we observe, so for instance, this practice that goes on between law enforcement agencies where they settle out of court, like someone says, try to settle in the interest of the family and all of that. Whenever we find things like that, I think we should try to test them. And while, of course, I also know that a lot of times that could be quite time consuming and it could be costly too, but I also believe that there are organizations that would be willing to handle some of these. My organization, for instance, has handled quite a number of strategic litigation and public interest litigations in the past, and we're willing to take on some more, particularly if we are confident that they will impact positively on the developing jurisprudence regarding the violence against persons. And perhaps I should also mention that, yes, while we're talking about collaboration, this collaboration must not only be limited to CSOs and maybe law enforcement agencies. The collaboration must go all the way, even into the core judicial system. The judicial system, and even the correctional services. Why do I say this? There is a development in Ekiti State that gives me joy every time I think about it. You find they have developed a register of offenders. And I think things like this, if it can be nationalized, if we can, create such a database across the country, will to a large extent reduce incidences of GBV. Why do I think so? First, I don't think there's any reasonable person who would want their names to be found on that list. That's one. So I expect that it's going to push people to behave properly on one hand. On the other hand, it's going to have a deterrent effect. On the other hand, For those who have been found wanting in the past, I mean, it's going to be a red flag for anybody, for instance, who wants to have dealings with them. You want to employ them, you want to rent your, houses and things like that. You quickly get to know that, look, this is the kind of person you are dealing with. And perhaps that would also have the effect of reducing incidences of gender-based violence. And a lot of comments have been made regarding ensuring that the justice system is survival centered. And please, I also want to think that we can actually use the instrumentality of public interest litigations and strategic litigations to also get the government to the justice system. Let me not say just the government. Let me say the justice system, to push the justice system to start strengthening restorative justice by institutionalizing the provisions that are already contained in the laws that we have, and perhaps challenging stigmatization and retaliation and protecting whistleblowers. This is something that I only got to start thinking. I just started thinking about a couple of weeks ago regarding the matter I mentioned earlier, because we had whistleblowers, and those whistleblowers eventually became targets themselves of the perpetrator. Became a challenge for us. So while we're trying to help the primary victim, we also now have to start making provisions to support the whistleblower. So I think really, if we are able to put these things together, if we're able to push and work collaboratively, there is the chance that we will eventually. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. So strategic litigation, public interest litigation, these are the steps. Restorative justice, these are the steps towards realizing some of these legal provisions so that they now become a norm in our legal system. So thank you very much. Ms. Grace, I would also like to get your perspective working with the Human Rights Commission on some of the work that you've done, the strategies or the ways that you have also prioritized the needs of survivors during the course of your work in responding to certain cases regarding children and other victims of gender-based violence, women as well. Ms. Grace, if you can hear me. If you can hear me, you're muted, I think.
Yeah. Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
No,
I
yeah.
don't know if you got the question.
No, yeah. No, I didn't.
Okay, I was asking for you to share your own experience in the course of the work that you have done with Human Rights Commission, just some of the ways or strategies that you have utilized in ensuring, prioritizing the needs of survivors in responding to cases like this, cases around violence against them, women, girls, and children.
No, I didn't get you well. Okay. Hello, Noah. Noah.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Sorry, I didn't.
Okay, maybe you should turn off your maybe you should turn off your camera so that the network is stronger. I think the bandwidth is low. Maybe you should turn off your camera if you can hear me.
I've tried to. Yeah.
Okay, is it better now?
Hello?
Yes, is it better now?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I was asking, okay, thank you. All right, so I will just ask if you just briefly, quickly share your, yes, can you hear me? Oh,
yes, but it the line is on and off, but I can hear you.
Okay,
I should share what?
Your perspective, in the course of the work that you have done with Human Rights Commission.
Quickly share on GBV, my perspective generally.
So, hear me, ma?
I want to be sure this problem is
Hello?
not from me. Please, if any of the panelists can hear me, can they just indicate? I just want
Yes,
to be
we
sure
can
that.
hear you. Mrs. Palm, she wanted for you to share from your
Yes.
perspective of the work you've done at the National Human Rights Commission, how the structures can be further strengthened. Am I right, Noya? Was that the question?
Our
Yeah.
structures at the National Human Rights
How
Commission.
I was asking about how they ensure the prioritization of the needs of survivors in responding
Oh,
to.
okay. Oh, yes.
Um,
Oh, now
Okay,
I'm
the
sorry.
needs of
Yes. How
prioritizing their needs.
yes,
yes,
please.
ma'am. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Like I said earlier, we handle the issues of GBV that comes to us, and we have a lot of issues coming really on GBV. And what we do is we investigate the complaints that come to us and seek redress on behalf of the survivors. And what we do is we collaborate with other organizations, like I said earlier, either with the police or the Ministry of Justice or or anyway, any of the organizations that, there are many organizations we work with. So those we work with, especially on criminal matters. Then we have NGOs that we work with in enlightening the public on the issues of GBV, because enlightenment is very key. Sometimes people do these things and they fend ignorance, and especially in the communities. The National Human Rights Commission, we have 36 states, 36 offices in all the 36 states in Nigeria. And we do a lot of this enlightenment in the communities, because a lot of the communities, take it or not, are very ignorant of these issues. They just take them, like normal day-to-day things. A woman is raped, so what? A woman is a sex object, so I mean, there's nothing new about it. Who knows if she wanted it as well? Girls are raped, and then within the conflict areas, children who are already vulnerable are doubly vulnerable, because once there's conflict, the children are vulnerable. And then you add, like violations against them, physical violations against them again. Children are deprived of food, their health issues, so many issues attached to it. And what the National Human Rights Commission, we advocate to other sister organizations, like, to take up, especially maybe international NGOs, take up the issues of paying for health care for these children, setting up camps, enlightening the community leaders. And there are some things that you have to get the buying of these community leaders, whether we like it or not, because if once they say something, it becomes like the law in that place. Once a community leader says this is what should be done, that's what everybody does. So we try to get them their buying. We get them on board and try to enlighten them so that they in turn, enlighten their people about the about GBV and why it must stop, and why we must put an end to GBV. So we do a lot of enlightenment, and then we have trained. We have counselors. We have counselors in our offices. We have trained counselors who give psychosocial counseling as well. And then we work with other NGOs to try to reintegrate, especially Maiduguri crisis. We reintegrate the victims, the survivors, back into their communities. So those are some of the things that we do. In some of the interventions, we do at the National Human Rights Commission. We've also set up panels of inquiry, also in Maiduguri, to investigate the issues of violations against some of the girls, especially the returnees, some of the girls that have been returned from captivity, of the insurgents. We're doing an inquiry into that. And if you remember the Reuters reports that there were like 10,000 abortions done in the Northeast, the National Human Rights Commission also set up a panel of inquiry, to investigate were there such violations, were there such forced abortions in the Northeast, the 3 states where there's insurgency in the Northeast. So these are some of the things that we have done concerning GBV.
Thank you very much, Ma. There's lots of sensitization, lots of education and enlightenment being done, and a lot of collaboration. Thank you so much for that.
Yes.
Right before here, we'll take from Mr. Mohammed just in a minute. So, and then after that, we'll get 1 or 2 perspectives from the audience. But in the meantime, if you have any comments you'd like to share, if you're a participant, you can drop them in the comments. I'll be reading some before the end of this webinar, and then I'll take some other people who would like to speak as well, or if they have any questions. Mr. Mohammed, you have already touched on and extensively highlighted some of the challenges that the children that you work with face with regards to gender-based sexual violence and other forms of violence. But then one thing that you also pointed out was how neglected they are in general response mechanisms and frameworks. What do you think, from what you have seen firsthand, what do you think are some of the ways that they can be better integrated into broader response frameworks in Nigeria, so that they also do not suffer another level of violence and neglect?
Thank you so much, Noya. And just like I think Ms. Abby have highlighted and other speakers, is of course getting them to be part of whatever response strategy that organization, government are building. And I'm glad that I think at many levels across the state, we are seeing children being invited on conversations that affect them in many cases. Those are, let me say, maybe urban children, but of course the most vulnerable children don't also get the opportunity to be part of such conversation. But essentially, empowering them and letting them know about what this violence entails. Teaching them about child protection concerns that are common, abuse, violence, so that they know, okay, and through that such empowerment, I believe they can be better integrated into any response mechanism and framework that states and NGOs like us will be developing, as a way to respond to their issues. So essentially, child centers respond and empowering them through whatever programs or initiative. And I think this is one area that our organization is beginning to work on seriously, seeing how children in the barest minimum know their own right as children. And that way they can be able to, make the move to respond as children, because previously if they're either abused, they don't know that they should report on all of that. So one way is that empowerment, I think, more seriously, and then getting them involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So empowerment, education, and ensuring their involvement in the process of developing response frameworks. Thank you so much. So we'll take 1 or 2 questions, comments, statements from the participants. I'll read some of them. Someone says here, the government must take responsibility for addressing GBV in their states, as NGOs have limited resources. Law enforcement agencies in the GBV department face challenges due to lack of funding and tools, while court delays discourage victims from pursuing justice, making them vulnerable to intimidation and bribery by perpetrators. Okay. Somebody is asking the procedures and stages to respond to GBV cases for those that are living in rural areas. So I don't know this is a question actually. She's from Kano State, so she would like to know what some of the procedures or the process. So, assuming somebody is a victim at the community level or in a rural area and is not necessarily aware of the response mechanisms or how to go about responding to GBV, what are some of the steps that a survivor of gender-based violence in the community or in a rural setting should take in responding to that case? I don't know if Dr. Mercy can answer that question because I know she does lots of work, a lot of response work with STARE. Dr. Mercy, can you hear me? I don't think she. Okay. Okay, I can hear you now. I think you were muted.
Yes, my network is breaking really bad.
Oh, sorry about that. But we can hear you now, though.
Okay. I didn't get the last part of the question. Sorry about that.
Okay, so I think the person works at the community level and is just asking that in case of a survivor who is in a rural community, what are the steps to, lodge complaints or respond, or cases that happen at that community level? What would be the first step to take for a victim of gender-based violence?
Thank you for asking that question. So most of what we do, and that's where our advocacy has been centered on recently, is actually teaching local communities across Nigeria what to do when somebody has been sexually violated. The first thing is to identify the closest SAC center and to identify a police station to make a report. The police station report is very important because most sexual abusers, right, might not have seen their day in court due to different technicalities. However, once the case is reported and there's already precedence, it gives more validity to the case, and therefore the case can be carried. Another thing we always tell people, again, and one thing that has also been emphasized on this call, is to adopt a survivor-centered approach. So it depends on who the survivor is. If the survivor is a child, we require you to, we advise you to make a police report and take that child to a government hospital or a SAC center. One of these two would work. Another thing that would work would also be reporting through. Most communities have a reporting system through their local leadership, right? So to also make that report as well. As if it's in the case of an adult, adopt a survivor-centered approach, getting the survivor the need, the basic, the first aid need that they need at that particular time, and basically following up with the hospital so that they can be given the necessary treatments to avoid all forms of infection and to avoid all forms of transmittable diseases. Another thing that we always encourage people to do is to reach out to local organizations within you. On many directories, you have, on many websites, you have directories of different organizations that function at communal levels in different states that can be reached via WhatsApp and via various online platforms, and also just having a number. Another response mechanism that works very well is that in some states like Ekiti that was mentioned and Lagos, there are toll-free numbers that can be called. I know that a couple of states do have some toll-free numbers, but if those toll-free numbers are not easily accessible, please call an organization that is centered around helping citizens to direct you on how to, engage with survivors. I know that when it has to do with the case of a minor, parents will step in and maybe elders will step in and say, oh, don't do this, don't do that. However, the VAP law stipulates that as a bystander, you also have a responsibility of reporting these cases. So those are some of the steps that I would suggest that you take. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I hope that answers your question, Mashkura. There's a comment here from Mr. Idosa. Bridging these gaps requires a multi-sectoral approach that prioritizes survival-centered responses, integrates prevention strategies, and leverages community-based solutions. Very true. Another comment, I think one key element missing is state funding and budget allocation for SGBV response at the national and subnational levels. There's a question here, what are the integrated stages or procedures at the informal level supposed to be used in responding to GBV cases? And I think this is a little bit similar. I'll take a page out of Mercy's book in responding to this and just say that at the end of the day, informal systems like we have said today, like Mr. Mohammed, like Abby and Ms. Grace have pointed out correctly, is not doesn't have a governance structure. It does not ensure accountability and definitely does not ensure justice. So it's definitely something that should go hand in hand with formal systems, and we have to ensure that formal systems are in place and are strengthened first, and then we can then collaborate with the informal sector at the community level, you know, with traditional or religious leaders to ensure there is a coordination of efforts in responding to these cases. There's another question here, very long one. Somebody's asking, okay, this is a comment. The traditional rulers resist changing customs that violate women's rights. Many rural areas lack awareness of the BAP law. That's very true. I've talked a lot about capacity building, awareness creation, and education. Okay, so unfortunately, I can't read all of it here. We're already past our time. So very quickly, we get last thoughts, final thoughts from the speakers in about 30 seconds each. Let's just hear closing thoughts, and then we can then pass over to the executive directors to give our closing remarks before we call it a day. So again, I'll start with Dr. Mercy, then Barrister Deji, Ms. Grace, Mr. Mohammed, and then Ms. Abby will take the final thoughts and then the closing. So Dr. Mercy, if there's any final thoughts in a minute or less that you'd like to share, please. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. This has been indeed a very enriching conversation. I've learned so much from Ms. Abby and Mrs. Grace and Mohammed as well, and Barrister Deji. I would like to say that it's a continuous process, right? We may not even have scratched the surface of getting it right, but it's a process that we continuously have to work towards to getting it right. Sometime in October, I was asked by a German parliamentary member to ask do we have coordinated spaces, like coordinated CSO spaces that deal and respond to certain issues and put pressure on the government to make a change? And I could not categorically answer that question because I know that on different fronts, coalitions are formed, groups are formed to put pressure. But once that effort has been, frustrated by the Nigerian political system, everybody just goes their own way. So I'm saying this also as a call to action to say that, we have a lot of role to play, especially the CSO and the NGO space. We have a lot of responsibility. In many countries across the world, one of the reasons that they have gotten progress and they have grown to the level that we now admire their systems in dealing with issues regarding sexual and gender-based violence is because of the roles that CSOs and NGO played in building and bridging that gap. So the continuous effort, having conversations, and also having action points, actionable steps to seeing how we can have more coordinated efforts, to seeing how we can, gather and harness our data on the field would actually help us make more informed and deliberate steps in addressing issues regarding sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you for having me on this panel. I really enjoyed having this conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marcia. Thank you so much for being here. Barrister Deji, over to you.
Hi, Deji.
Barrister Deji, if you can hear me, you're muted. I don't know if you're speaking.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I think and for a final word is basically a summary of everything that we have said. I think CSOs need to continue to do what they have been doing before now. They need to continue advocacy. They need to continue capacity building. They need to continue how to develop the jurisprudence relating to GBV. And of course, we must now be more intentional about making the GBV justice system survivor centered. Like Biodo said earlier, we should be talking to them. We should be listening to them. For events like this, programs like this, they should be available. They should be able to speak. Let's hear from them, and let interventions be tailored towards those specific needs that they are expressing. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, sir, for being here, for sharing your thoughts. Miss Grace, if you can hear me, we're taking closing thoughts in a minute or less. I don't know if you're speaking, but you're muted now. Okay, I think we'll pass it on to Mr. Mohammed then.
Hello?
Okay, she's back. Okay, yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay. I was just saying that, yeah, this issue of gender-based violence, I think we've been on it for quite a number of years in this country, and we are seeing very little changes. So I'm wondering if we are doing the right thing, or should we change direction? What should be done? So we need to take concrete efforts to ensure that we get it right, so that each year in, year out, we'll not be talking about the same thing, that this is what we need to do and nothing is being done. Let's be proactive about it. And I think we must also involve the communities. It's very important, because the communities, that's where it should start from, really, from the homes, from the communities, and before we even get to the national level. So please, whatever interventions we're doing, we should ensure that this community people are carried along, so that from there we can go a bottom up approach. I think will work better, because like one of us said, the laws are already there, so it's not a lack of the laws, but it's a lack of implementation. There's a gap between the laws and implementation. So we have to work towards that, so that we can ensure that when next we're talking about the issues of GBV, we're talking with figures that this is success stories. Let's be talking about our success stories and not lamenting where we are. So with that, I want to thank you very much, for having me on this platform.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your thoughts and for being here. Okay, so Mr. Mohammed,
Okay,
over to you.
Thank you. Just to pick up from where Ms. Greg up, in terms of questioning why the issue is still, it seems like things are not being addressed, So perhaps as an institution, government institution, and maybe global well, we can do a system thinking analysis of it, and it's obvious that maybe symptoms of GBV and not really at what are the root causes, and so interventions are not coherent in a way. So my final word indeed is just to of course reinforce what I said earlier on about ensuring that interventions for survivors or victims are coherent, and then also I'm also glad that the usually when it comes to issue of interventions and responses, those that are vulnerable and those missing in conversation. So I'm glad that Global Right has specifically, brought up the issue of those vulnerable children, like the Almajiri, those in street situation, and those in visible and rural community. And my final comment is really, really spotlighting issues affecting populations in rural community, because there are a lot of them there suffering in silence without any. So thank you so much, Lawyer, for the invitation, and it's good seeing Grace, Mercy, Ms. Abby, everyone, Deji, and everyone. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your closing thoughts. So at this point, I will pass over to Ms. Abby, who will share her closing thoughts and bring this webinar to an official close. Thank you very much. Abby, over to you.
Thank you, Noya. First, I'd like to thank the panelists. You've done a good job teasing out what the issues are. And I'm really hoping that we have not just had a conversation, but we can push this towards policy. I'd like us to reflect particularly on what MSK has to do a systems thinking and think through how the system we currently run either serves service to victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. I think there's a lot that's been said in the room. The gaps have been pointed out, but I'd like to make a plug again to what Dr. Mercy had said about ensuring that we're also talking to one another, that we're bringing these coalitions to bear on issues that matter. Global Rights, for example, at Global Rights, we belong to many coalitions of rapid response for civic actors. But then we must also begin to think about rapid response for victims of sexual and gender-based violence at the risk of belonging to too many coalitions. I will particularly direct my final thoughts to Mrs. Palm and to you, Noya. To Mrs. Palm, because the National Human Rights Commission holds such power that I feel is grossly underutilized, that you can bring together to form this task force. Yes, there are SACs. Yes, there are domestic and sexual violence response teams, but that how effective have they been? And how about the cases that are reported to the commission to bring together civil society, government actors, particularly law enforcement, and the force of civil service to bear for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. The Human Rights Commission can lead the conversation. And to you, Noya, because you run one of the most powerful platforms, Rape is a Crime, and the potentials that Rape is a Crime holds in bringing and coordinating action amongst both the response and the demand side of justice for survivors of sexual violence. I will task you to think deeper about how you can bring us all to bear. There are people who need services. There are so many organizations and government agencies that offer service. How do you amplify and make the connections more real, with or without funding? Finally, to every participant who's joined us today, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for caring about these issues. Thank you for doing the little you do in your little corner, which is all adding up to a great in ensuring that we have a safe country. Each one teach one. Rape is a crime. Domestic violence is a crime. Workplace violence, sexual violence in the place of work and in public forums are crimes. Sexual violence, gender-based violence in conflict situations are also crimes. Let us treat them as such. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. Over to you, Noya.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abby, and thank you so much to all our speakers. And I have been left with this very important charge that I'll take a lot of time to think about. So to continue our conversation and to follow up with the work that we do at Global Rights, please follow us on our social media at Global Rights NG on Twitter and on Instagram, and at Rape is a Crime NG _ on Twitter and Instagram. These conversations are ongoing, and we consistently have them through various fora. So please continue to engage with us and engage with our work, because we're all partners in these calls. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great Friday and a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Oh.